Hey guys, tonight we begin with a land of kings, fire temples, and empires so vast they made even the Romans slightly uncomfortable. The world of ancient Persia. Long before modern Iran, this was a place of towering palaces, golden capitals, and rulers who called themselves King of Kings. Which, to be fair, is a pretty confident job title. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Long before emperors carved their names into stone, before palaces rose from the dust, and messengers sprinted across royal highways like ancient Amazon delivery drivers. The land of ancient Iran was something far less glamorous and far less forgiving. The Iranian plateau was not designed for comfort. It was a place of extremes. Summers that felt like the sun had a personal vendetta against you. Winters that could freeze your ambitions solid. And vast stretches of land that looked at your farming plans and politely said, no. Water was precious. Shade was rare, and survival depended less on strength and more on patience, stubbornness, and the ability to not make terrible decisions before lunch. The people who settled here were part of the Indo-Iranian migrations, arriving sometime during the 2nd millennium BCE. They didn't arrive with cities, temples, or 5-star accommodations. They came with animals, weapons, and traditions, especially horses, which quickly became their greatest asset. In a landscape this wide and unforgiving, walking everywhere was not a personality trait. It was a mistake. Life was tribal. Small groups moved across the land, herding animals, searching for grazing areas, and occasionally arguing over who had the better patch of dry grass. Leadership wasn't about crowns or divine right. It was about competence. If you could keep people alive, you were in charge. If you couldn't, well, your leadership term was likely very short. And yet, even in this harsh world, something deeper was forming. These early Iranians carried a rich oral culture, stories, songs, and beliefs passed down through generations. With no written records, everything depended on memory. So if you forgot an important story, congratulations, you just deleted history. They looked at the natural world, the sky, the wind, and especially fire, and saw something meaningful. Fire wasn't just useful. It was life. It kept predators away, warmed freezing nights, and gave light in a world that had absolutely no concept of street lamps. Naturally, they respected it, probably more than they respected each other on a bad day. Morality also began to take shape. Truth and honor weren't abstract ideas. They were survival tools. In small tribes, trust wasn't optional. If you lied too much, people stopped trusting you. And if people stopped trusting you, well, good luck surviving alone in a place where even the weather is against you. There were no great empires yet, no kings calling themselves divine, no massive armies marching across continents, just people, harsh land, and a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, something bigger was coming. And when it did, it would not be subtle. As these early tribes slowly adapted to the harsh realities of the Iranian plateau, something unusual began to happen. They started organizing, not perfectly, not peacefully, and definitely not without arguments, but enough to move from scattered groups into something resembling a kingdom. And at the center of this shift were the Medes. By the 7th century BCE, the Medes had gone from just another group trying to survive to a serious regional power. They settled in the northwest of the Iranian plateau, an area slightly more forgiving than the endless dry interior, which, in ancient terms, basically meant you had a better chance of not immediately regretting your life choices. According to later sources, their early king Deoses supposedly united the tribes by offering something revolutionary: justice. People were tired of chaos, revenge cycles, and the constant, he stole my goat, so I stole his entire family type of problem solving. So they chose a king who promised order, and surprisingly, it worked. The Medes formed a centralized kingdom, built a capital at Ecbatana, and began acting like a proper state instead of a loose collection of people hoping for the best. They developed systems of governance, alliances, and, of course, armies. Because no ancient civilization ever said, You know what? Let's skip the army part. Their real moment came when they teamed up with others to bring down the Neo-Assyrian Empire. One of the most feared powers of the ancient world. The Assyrians were known for their military strength and, let's just say, not their gentle diplomacy. So defeating them wasn't just impressive. It was a statement. For a brief moment, the Medes stood at the top. They controlled a significant portion of the region and looked like they might be the ones to build a lasting empire. But here's the thing about early empires. They're fragile. Internal divisions, power struggles, and the constant need to keep everyone in line made stability difficult. And while the Medes were strong, they weren't unshakable. Because somewhere within their own system, a new power was quietly growing. The Persians. At first, they were just another group under Median rule. Nothing too threatening. Nothing that would keep you awake at night. But history has a habit of turning not a threat into this is a problem very quickly. And soon, the Medes would learn that lesson the hard way. At first, the Persians didn't look particularly impressive. They were just one group among many, living under the authority of the Medes, paying their dues, minding their business, and probably trying not to get dragged into unnecessary conflicts. If you had asked anyone at the time who would dominate the region, the Persians would not have been the obvious choice. And then came Cyrus the Great. Now, history loves to call people the Great, but in this case, it's actually justified. Cyrus wasn't just another ambitious leader looking to grab power. He was something far more dangerous, a leader who understood both conquest and control. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus rebelled against the Medes, and not in a subtle, let's negotiate this over tea kind of way. This was a full-scale overthrow. The Median king, Astyages, was defeated, and just like that, the balance of power shifted. The Persians were no longer under anyone. They were in charge. But here's where Cyrus did something unusual. Something that set him apart from most conquerors. He didn't destroy everything. When Cyrus expanded his rule, he allowed conquered peoples to keep their customs, religions, and traditions. No forced cultural wipeouts, no unnecessary destruction. It was less submit or be crushed, and more submit, pay taxes, and carry on with your life. Which, in the ancient world, was basically revolutionary. When he conquered Babylon, one of the greatest cities of the time, he didn't burn it or enslave its population. Instead, he presented himself as a liberator. He even allowed exiled groups, like the Jews, to return to their homeland. It was a masterclass in strategy, because people are much easier to rule when they don't hate you. Cyrus wasn't just building an empire through force. He was building loyalty, or at least something close enough to it that people didn't immediately plan rebellions every weekend. And it worked. In a relatively short time, Cyrus created what became known as the Achaemenid Empire, the largest empire the world had seen up to that point. From Anatolia to Central Asia, from Mesopotamia to the edges of India, Persia wasn't just expanding, it was taking over everything. And for the first time, the scattered, harsh lands of Iran were no longer just surviving. They were leading the world. With Cyrus the Great gone, you might expect the empire to wobble, collapse, or at least take a short break from conquering everything in sight. It did not. Instead, it kept growing. Under his successors, particularly Cambyses II, Persia expanded even further. Egypt, one of the oldest and most stable civilizations on Earth, was brought under Persian control, which is impressive because Egypt had been doing its own thing for thousands of years and wasn't exactly looking for new management. But Persia managed it anyway. At its height, the Achaemenid Empire stretched from Anatolia in the west to the Indus Valley in the east. It included Mesopotamia, Egypt, parts of Central Asia, and territories that covered 3 continents. This wasn't just an empire anymore. This was something new. For the first time in history, millions of people, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, and living completely different lifestyles, were ruled under a single political system. And somehow, it didn't immediately fall apart, which honestly feels suspicious, because managing a single city is hard enough. Managing an empire this size? That's a logistical nightmare. You've got distant provinces, slow communication, local rebellions, and governors who may or may not be loyal depending on the day. So how did Persia handle it? With structure, the empire was divided into regions, each governed by officials responsible for maintaining order and collecting taxes. Local traditions were largely respected, which helped reduce resistance. People didn't feel like their entire identity was being erased, just slightly supervised. And then there was communication. The Persians developed systems that allowed messages to travel quickly across vast distances. Couriers moved along established routes, carrying information from one end of the empire to the other. It wasn't instant, obviously. No one was sending texts. But for the ancient world, it was incredibly efficient. The result? An empire that didn't just expand, it functioned. And for a moment, it seemed unstoppable. But as with all large empires, the bigger it became, the harder it would be to control. And soon, someone would step in to test just how strong this system really was. If Cyrus the Great was the visionary, and Cambyses II was the expansionist, then Darius the Great was the administrator, the man who looked at this massive, slightly chaotic empire and said, "All right, we need to get organized. Immediately." Because here's the truth. Conquering land is one thing. Keeping it is another. When Darius came to power, the empire was already enormous, but it was also unstable. Revolts had broken out in several regions, and the whole system was dangerously close to becoming a very large, very expensive disaster. So Darius did what any competent ruler would do. He fixed everything. First, he divided the empire into provinces known as satrapies. Each one was governed by a satrap, essentially a regional manager, but with significantly more power and slightly fewer performance reviews. Their job was to collect taxes, maintain order, and make sure no one was planning anything creative like a rebellion. But Darius didn't blindly trust them. He installed inspectors, often called the king's eyes and ears, who travelled across the empire, checking on these governors. Think of them as ancient auditors, except instead of sending emails, they reported directly to the king. And if something looked suspicious, it usually didn't end well for the person in charge. Then came taxes. Darius standardized them. Instead of random demands or sudden, "we need more gold this week" policies, each region had a fixed tribute based on its wealth and resources. It was predictable, structured, and, most importantly, efficient. And then there was infrastructure. Darius expanded the royal road, a massive network stretching across the empire. Messages could travel thousands of kilometers in a matter of days, thanks to a relay system of couriers. Herodotus famously described it as unstoppable. Neither snow, rain, heat, nor darkness kept them from their duty, which, frankly, is more dedication than most modern delivery services. Trade flourished, communication improved, control tightened. Darius also introduced a standardized currency, the daric, making commerce across the empire smoother and more consistent. No more awkward, "I'll trade you 3 goats for that" negotiations. By the time he was done, the Achaemenid Empire wasn't just big. It was a system, a machine. Efficient, controlled, and remarkably stable for something that covered half the known world. But machines, no matter how well built, eventually face resistance. And in Persia's case, that resistance was waiting to the west. Once Darius the Great had turned the empire into a functioning machine, he did something every powerful ruler eventually does. He built something massive, just to make a point. That something was Persepolis. Now, this wasn't your average city. It wasn't meant to be crowded with merchants yelling about prices or farmers dragging carts through narrow streets. Persepolis was ceremonial, a stage, a place designed to impress, intimidate, and quietly remind everyone exactly who was in charge. And it worked. Built on a stone terrace, Persepolis rose above the surrounding land like it had something to prove. Massive staircases led up to grand halls, each decorated with carvings so detailed they practically told stories on their own. Delegations from across the empire were depicted bringing tribute, gifts, animals, precious materials, all marching in orderly lines toward the king. It was subtle. If by subtle you mean, look at how everyone answers to us. The Apadana, the great audience hall, was supported by towering columns, each topped with sculpted animals, bulls, lions, symbols of strength and authority. Walking into that space must have felt less like entering a building and more like entering a statement. And that was the point. Persepolis wasn't just architecture, it was propaganda. Every detail reinforced the same message. This empire is vast, organized, and unchallenged. People from different lands, wearing different clothing, speaking different languages, all unified under one ruler. Even the layout was intentional. The slow, wide staircases allowed visitors to approach with dignity, not rush in, which sounds respectful, but also meant you had plenty of time to think about how powerful the people at the top were. And then came the ceremonies. New Year celebrations, known as Nowruz, brought representatives from across the empire to Persepolis. They would present gifts to the king, reaffirm loyalty, and participate in rituals that emphasized unity, or at least the appearance of it. Because behind all this beauty and order, maintaining control over such a vast empire was never simple. Loyalty had to be constantly reinforced. Power had to be constantly displayed. Persepolis was a reminder, carved in stone, that Persia wasn't just ruling the world. It wanted everyone to know it. While kings built palaces and armies marched across continents, most people in the Achaemenid Empire were doing something far less dramatic. They were living their lives. No grand speeches, no epic battles, just farming, trading, raising families, and trying to avoid becoming part of someone else's tax report. The Persian world was incredibly diverse. With territories stretching across 3 continents, daily life looked very different depending on where you were. A farmer in Mesopotamia lived a completely different reality from a merchant in Anatolia, or a herder on the Iranian plateau. And yet there were common threads. Agriculture was the backbone of society. Wheat, barley, and livestock kept the empire fed. Irrigation systems, especially underground channels known as qanats, allowed water to be transported across dry regions, which, in a place where rain was unreliable, was basically the difference between survival and, well, that didn't go well. Cities were centres of trade and administration. Markets were busy, noisy, and full of goods from across the empire. Spices, textiles, metals. If you wanted something exotic, chances are someone had already imported it from a place you couldn't pronounce. Trade routes connected distant regions, allowing not just goods but ideas to travel. And unlike many empires, Persia didn't try to force everyone into a single cultural mould. Local customs were largely respected, which meant you could be Persian without actually being Persian. Social structure existed, of course. Nobles, priests, artisans, farmers, everyone had their place. But compared to some other ancient societies, there was a surprising level of flexibility. Skilled individuals could rise through service, especially in administration or the military. And then there was something the Persians took very seriously: truth. Lying wasn't just frowned upon, it was considered one of the worst things you could do. Ancient sources often mention that Persians were taught, from a young age, 3 things: to ride a horse, to shoot a bow, and to tell the truth, which is an interesting combination, because nothing says moral integrity quite like being able to gallop at full speed while armed. Family life was central. Households were tight-knit, with strong expectations around loyalty and honour. Women, especially in elite classes, could hold property and influence, though society was still largely patriarchal. Religion, of course, was everywhere, shaping behaviour, rituals, and daily decisions. But at its core, life in ancient Persia wasn't just about empire. It was about balance, between order and chaos, truth and lies, survival and ambition. And somehow, in a world this vast and complex, most people manage to find their place in it. If you really want to understand ancient Persia, you don't start with the kings. You start with the worldview, because beneath the armies, the palaces, and the carefully organised empire was something much more powerful. A belief system that shaped how people thought, acted, and judged the world around them. That belief system was Zoroastrianism, and at the centre of it was Zoroaster, a figure whose exact dates are still debated, which is historian language for "we're not entirely sure, but he was definitely important." Zoroaster introduced a radical idea: the world is not random. It is a battlefield. On one side stands Ahura Mazda, the god of truth, light, and order. On the other, Angra Mainyu, the force of chaos, darkness, and everything that goes wrong at the worst possible time. This wasn't symbolic. It was literal. Every action, every decision, every thought contributed to this ongoing struggle. There was no neutral ground. You were either helping truth or helping chaos, which suddenly makes everyday decisions feel a lot more dramatic. Do the right thing? You're supporting cosmic order. Lie, cheat, or act selfishly? Congratulations. You're technically helping the forces of darkness. No pressure. Zoroastrianism emphasized three core principles: good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Simple in theory, slightly harder in practice, especially when life involves taxes, politics, and other people. But the idea was powerful. For the first time, morality wasn't just about rules or traditions. It was about responsibility. Individuals had a role to play in shaping the fate of the universe. And unlike many earlier belief systems, Zoroastrianism introduced a clear concept of judgment after death. Your actions mattered not just in life, but beyond it. There was reward for the righteous and consequences for those who chose poorly. It also influenced daily life in visible ways. Fire, for example, became sacred, a symbol of purity and truth, not something to be casually disrespected or used for roasting questionable decisions. Temples maintained eternal flames, carefully tended by priests. Rituals were precise, structured, and meaningful. But perhaps the most interesting part, this belief system didn't just stay in Persia. Its ideas about good versus evil, judgment, and the end of time would echo through later religions and philosophies. So while empires rise and fall and kings come and go, the ideas that shape them tend to last much longer. And in Persia's case, those ideas burned just as brightly as the fire they revered. If Zoroastrianism gave the Persians their worldview, then fire gave that worldview a visible living presence, not symbolic in a vague, poetic way, but real, constant and carefully maintained. In ancient Persia, fire was sacred, not because people thought flames were magical in themselves, but because they represented something deeper: truth, purity, and the presence of Ahura Mazda. Fire didn't lie. It revealed, it illuminated. It consumed what was impure and left nothing hidden, which honestly makes it a pretty intimidating religious symbol. Temples were built to house these sacred flames. Inside, priests tended fires that were never allowed to go out. Ever. Not overnight, not during storms, not even when someone probably forgot to check the wood supply, because if the flame went out, that was not a good sign. These temples weren't loud or chaotic. There were no massive crowds shouting or dramatic performances. Instead, rituals were controlled, precise, and deeply intentional. Priests known as magi followed strict rules of purity. Even their breath was considered something that could contaminate the sacred fire, so they often covered their mouths during rituals, which is both fascinating and a subtle way of saying, please don't accidentally ruin the divine presence with your breathing. Cleanliness was extremely important. Not just physically, but spiritually. Water, earth, and fire were all considered pure elements, and polluting them was seen as a serious offence. This extended into daily life in ways that might feel intense by modern standards. For example, dealing with the dead required special care. In Zoroastrian practice, corpses were considered impure because they were believed to be touched by decay and corruption. So instead of burial or cremation, bodies were placed in structures known as towers of silence, where they were exposed to the elements and scavenging birds. Not exactly comforting, but very practical. It avoided contaminating the sacred elements. Rituals also marked important moments in life: birth, adulthood, marriage, and death. Each step reinforced the idea that life was a journey shaped by choices, constantly moving between order and chaos. Even festivals had deeper meaning. Celebrations like Nowruz, the Persian New Year, weren't just about starting fresh. They symbolized renewal, light overcoming darkness, and the ongoing victory of good over evil. So while outsiders might have seen fire temples as mysterious or even strange, to the Persians they were a constant reminder that every day, in every action, the battle between truth and chaos was still being fought. And whether you realized it or not, you were part of it. For all its philosophy, tolerance, and impressive architecture, the Achaemenid Empire did not become the largest empire on earth by being polite. It had an army, a very good one. The Persian military wasn't just about brute force. It was about organization, adaptability, and scale. Three things that tend to work well when you're trying to control half the known world. At its core, the army was incredibly diverse. Soldiers came from all across the empire. Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, and many more. Each group brought its own weapons, armour, and fighting styles, which sounds chaotic, but Persia turned it into an advantage. Instead of forcing everyone into one rigid system, they used that diversity strategically. Archers, cavalry, infantry, each had a role, and when coordinated properly, they became far more effective than a uniform but limited force. But of course, no discussion of the Persian army is complete without mentioning the elite unit known as the Immortals. Yes, that was their actual name. Not exaggerated, not poetic, just confidently intimidating. The Immortals were an elite force of 10,000 soldiers who served as both the king's guard and a key military unit. Their defining feature was simple. Their number never changed. If one soldier died, was injured, or even just had a bad day, he was immediately replaced. Always 10,000. No exceptions. To enemies, it must have looked like they literally couldn't be reduced, which is great for morale. If you're on their side, Persian soldiers were well equipped, often carrying bows, spears, and shields made from wicker. Their armour wasn't as heavy as some of their opponents, which made them more mobile, useful when fighting across different terrains, from deserts to mountains. And then there was the cavalry. Persia excelled at mounted warfare. Horses had been part of their culture for centuries, and it showed. Fast, flexible, and capable of striking quickly, cavalry units gave Persia a major tactical advantage. But perhaps the most important strength of the Persian army wasn't its weapons or its numbers, it was its system. Supply lines, communication, coordination, all supported by the infrastructure built under rulers like Darius the Great. Armies could move efficiently, receive orders, and maintain control over vast distances, which in ancient warfare was half the battle. For a long time this made Persia seem unstoppable, but eventually every powerful system meets resistance, and in Persia's case, that resistance was small, stubborn, and very, very determined. For a long time, the Achaemenid Empire expanded with remarkable confidence. Kingdom after kingdom fell into place, provinces were organised, and the system held together. And then Persia looked west. Across the sea lay the world of ancient Greece, not a unified empire, but a collection of independent city-states, small, divided, often arguing with each other, which, on paper, should have made them easy to conquer. But history rarely follows the script you expect. The conflict began under Darius the Great, after Greek cities in Asia Minor revolted against Persian rule. Athens, in particular, decided to get involved, which, from Persia's perspective, was a bit like someone poking a very large, very organised empire with a stick. Darius responded the only way empires usually do. He sent an army. In 490 BCE, Persian forces landed near the town of Marathon. The expectation was clear: overwhelm the Greeks, crush resistance, and move on. Instead, the Greeks charged. Heavily armoured hoplites advanced at speed, closing the distance before Persian archers could fully exploit their range. Against expectations, the Greeks won. And just like that, Persia realised this wouldn't be as easy as it thought. Then came Xerxes I, Darius's successor, and a man who was not interested in half measures. In 480 BCE, Xerxes launched a massive invasion of Greece. We're talking hundreds of thousands of troops, bridges built across the Hellespont, and a logistical effort so large it probably gave someone a permanent headache. This was meant to end the problem, and at first it looked promising. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a small Greek force, led by Leonidas I, attempted to hold back the Persian advance. They were eventually overwhelmed, but their resistance became legendary. Then came the sea. At the Battle of Salamis, the Greeks used their knowledge of the narrow straits to outmaneuver the larger Persian fleet. What should have been a decisive Persian victory turned into a costly defeat. And just like that, momentum shifted. Persia was still powerful, still vast, still capable, but it had met something new, an enemy that refused to behave predictably. The wars didn't destroy Persia, not even close, but they did something just as important. They proved that even the greatest empire in the world could be challenged. And once that idea exists, it doesn't go away. For generations, the Achaemenid Empire had stood as the dominant power of the known world. It had survived revolts, internal struggles, and even the stubborn resistance of the Greeks. It was still vast, still wealthy, still impressive, but underneath that strength, cracks had begun to form. By the 4th century BCE, the empire was no longer as unified as it once had been. Court politics had grown complicated. Regional loyalty wasn't always guaranteed, and the central authority wasn't as sharp as it had been under rulers like Darius the Great. And then, from the west, came a problem Persia could not ignore: Alexander the Great. Now, at first glance, Alexander didn't look like someone who should be able to take down the largest empire on earth. He was young, his kingdom of Macedon was relatively small compared to Persia, and his army, while highly trained, was significantly outnumbered. But Alexander had something Persia underestimated: momentum and a very aggressive personality. In 334 BCE, he crossed into Asia Minor and began his campaign against Persia. His first major victory came at the Battle of Granicus, where he defeated Persian forces and opened the door into the empire. Then came Issus. Here, Alexander faced Darius III directly. Despite having a larger army, Darius found himself outmaneuvered. The battlefield worked against him, and Alexander's tactics broke through Persian lines. Darius fled, which, historically speaking, is not great for morale, but the real turning point came at the Battle of Gaugamela. This was meant to be Persia's moment of redemption: a vast army, chosen ground, and one final chance to crush the invader. Instead, Alexander won again, through discipline, precision, and a willingness to take risks that probably made his generals nervous. He shattered Persian resistance. Darius fled once more, and this time the empire effectively collapsed. Cities fell, capitals were taken, and then came Persepolis. Alexander entered the city, the symbol of Persian power, and eventually ordered it burned. Whether it was revenge for earlier Persian actions in Greece or simply a dramatic statement is still debated. Either way, the message was clear. The empire was over. After more than 2 centuries, the Achaemenid Empire, once the greatest power in the world, had fallen. Not slowly, not gradually, but to one man who refused to believe it couldn't be done. And just like that, Persia's golden age came to an end. But Persia itself? That was a different story. With the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, you might expect Persia to simply fade into history. Another great civilization that rose, peaked, and disappeared. That did not happen. Because while empires can fall surprisingly fast, cultures are much harder to erase. After the death of Alexander the Great, his massive empire didn't hold together for long. Turns out, conquering everything is easier than organizing it after you're gone. His generals quickly divided the territory among themselves, leading to the formation of several successor states. One of these was the Seleucid Empire, which took control of much of Persia. And this is where things get interesting. The Seleucids brought Greek culture with them: language, art, architecture, and administrative ideas. Cities were built in a Hellenistic style. Greek became a language of power, and for a moment it looked like Persian identity might be absorbed into something new. But Persia wasn't that easy to overwrite. Local traditions, beliefs, and cultural habits didn't disappear. They adapted. Persian elites continued to hold influence. Zoroastrian practices persisted, and everyday life retained a strong Iranian character beneath the surface. It became a blend. Greek on the outside, Persian underneath, and over time that balance began to shift. By the 3rd century BCE, a new power emerged from the east: the Parthian Empire. Unlike the Seleucids, the Parthians were Iranian in origin, and they slowly pushed back against Greek control. They weren't in a rush. Parthian expansion was gradual, strategic, and occasionally frustrating if you were trying to stop them. But it worked. Eventually, they replaced Seleucid rule across most of Iran, restoring a sense of local control while still maintaining some of the blended cultural influences that had developed. The result was something uniquely Persian, but also something new, a civilization shaped by conquest, but not erased by it. Persia had lost its empire, yes, but it had not lost itself, and as history would soon prove, it wasn't finished rising. Not even close. Just when it seemed like Persia had settled into a quieter role under the Parthian Empire, history decided it wasn't done with dramatic comebacks. Because in the 3rd century CE, a new dynasty rose, one that looked at the past glory of the Achaemenid Empire and thought, yes, we'd like that again. Enter the Sasanian Empire, founded by Ardashir I. The Sasanians overthrew the Parthians and re-established a strong, centralized Persian state. And unlike their predecessors, they were not interested in blending quietly into the background. They wanted power, visible, unmistakable, and very intentional power. The Sasanians revived many elements of earlier Persian identity, especially religion. Zoroastrianism became more formalized and closely tied to the state. Fire temples were restored, priesthoods gained influence, and religious identity became a defining feature of the empire. This wasn't just belief anymore, it was policy. The empire itself was highly organized, with a strong bureaucracy, a structured military, and a clear hierarchy. Kings presented themselves not just as rulers, but as divine figures chosen to maintain order in the world, which conveniently also made questioning them a bit more complicated. And then there was their favourite activity, fighting the Roman Empire. For centuries, the Sasanians and the Romans, later the Byzantines, were locked in a cycle of conflict. Massive armies clashed across borders, cities changed hands, and neither side could fully defeat the other. It was less a war, and more a long-term rivalry with occasional breaks. But these wars came at a cost. Resources were drained, armies were stretched, and while both empires remained powerful, they were also slowly wearing themselves down. Still, at its height, the Sasanian Empire was a major force. Its art, architecture, and culture flourished. Trade routes connected it to distant regions, and its influence spread far beyond its borders. Persia was once again a world power. But beneath the strength there was a growing problem. Constant war, internal pressures, and rigid structures were beginning to take their toll. And just beyond the horizon, a new force was rising, one that would change Persia and the entire region forever. By the early 7th century, the Sasanian Empire was still powerful, but it was tired. Very tired. Decades of exhausting wars with the Byzantine Empire had drained resources, weakened the military, and stretched the empire to its limits. Victories had come, losses had followed, and the cycle repeated until even success started to feel expensive. At the same time, internal problems were quietly building. The political system had become rigid. Power struggles at the top created instability, while heavy taxation put pressure on the population. Nobles, priests, and military leaders all had their own interests, and keeping everyone aligned was becoming increasingly difficult. In other words, the system still looked strong from the outside, but inside it was starting to crack. And then, from the Arabian Peninsula, something new began to emerge. Not just another tribe, not just another army, a new religious and political force, Islam, under the leadership of Muhammad and later the early caliphs. Arab forces unified in a way that had rarely been seen before. Driven by belief, momentum, and a clear sense of purpose, they expanded rapidly beyond Arabia, and soon they reached Persia. At first, the Sasanians likely didn't see them as an existential threat. After all, Persia had faced countless enemies before: rebellions, rival empires, invasions. This seemed like just another challenge to handle. It wasn't. In a series of decisive battles, including the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, Persian forces were defeated. The system that had once held together one of the greatest empires in history began to collapse under pressure it could no longer manage. Cities fell. Authority weakened. Control slipped. And by the mid-7th century, the Sasanian Empire was gone. Not gradually, not symbolically. Gone. But here's the important part. Persia did not disappear, just as it had after Alexander. Persian culture adapted. It absorbed new influences, reshaped itself, and continued to exist, now within a framework that would redefine the region. Languages evolved. Traditions blended. Identity shifted. But the legacy of ancient Persia, its ideas, its systems, its worldview, did not vanish. It lived on, beneath the surface, influencing everything that came after. And that is what Iran was like before Islam. A world of fire temples and cosmic battles, of kings and vast empires, of ideas that would echo far beyond their time. And even after everything changed, you can still see it. Alexander the Great was not raised in a world where love was simple, private, or even particularly gentle. From the very beginning, affection and power were tangled together, impossible to separate, like a knot no one ever bothered to untie. His childhood was dominated by two forces constantly pulling in opposite directions. On one side stood his mother, Olympias, intense, devout, and just a little terrifying if you were on the wrong side of her. She didn't just love her son, she believed he was destined for something divine, not metaphorically, literally. According to her, Alexander wasn't merely the child of Philip II of Macedon, he was touched by the gods themselves, which is a lot of pressure to put on a child who hasn't even learned to tie his sandals yet. On the other side was Philip, a man who treated relationships more like political tools than emotional bonds. His court was filled with wives, alliances, and shifting loyalties. Love, in this environment, was rarely about feeling. It was about advantage. Watching this, Alexander learned early that intimacy could be strategic, and that closeness often came with conditions attached. And then there was education. Enter Aristotle, one of the greatest minds of the ancient world, tasked with shaping the thoughts of a boy already convinced he might be semi-divine. Aristotle taught him philosophy, ethics, science, but also filled his imagination with the heroic ideals of Homeric legends. In those stories, bonds between men were deep, emotional, and often blurred in ways that modern categories struggle to define. So by the time Alexander reached adolescence, his understanding of relationships was already complicated. He admired strength, loyalty, and beauty, often all at once, and often in people who stood beside him in battle rather than across a banquet table. And perhaps most importantly, he began to believe that the ordinary rules did not apply to him. Because when you grow up being told you are destined to conquer the world, you don't just expect to rule empires, you expect to experience life more intensely than anyone else. Love, friendship, desire, none of it was going to be moderate. For Alexander, even at a young age, everything was already beginning to move toward excess. If there was one person who stood at the centre of Alexander the Great's emotional world, it was Hephaestion, not a wife, not a political ally, not a passing figure in the chaos of conquest, but something far deeper and far more difficult to neatly define. They met as boys, growing up in the same elite Macedonian circles, trained together, educated together, possibly even under Aristotle. From the start, there was a natural symmetry between them. Hephaestion was not just another companion, he was the one who understood Alexander without explanation. And in a world where Alexander was constantly being told he was different, greater, destined, almost divine, that kind of understanding was rare and dangerously valuable. Ancient sources are frustratingly vague, which usually means one thing. Whatever existed between them didn't fit neatly into acceptable categories of the time. Some writers compared their bond to that of Achilles and Patroclus, the legendary pair from Homer's Iliad. And that comparison wasn't accidental. Alexander idolized Achilles to an almost obsessive degree, and it's hard not to notice how closely he mirrored that relationship in his own life. So what were they exactly? Close friends? Certainly. Political partners? Definitely. Something more? That's where historians start to argue, and where things get interesting. What we do know is this. Hephaestion held a position no one else could touch. He was trusted with military command, diplomatic missions, and access to Alexander himself that bordered on exclusive. While others had to earn favour, Hephaestion simply had it. And Alexander did not hide that. In fact, he elevated Hephaestion in ways that made other commanders deeply uncomfortable. There were moments when it became clear that loyalty to Alexander also meant accepting Hephaestion's influence, which, naturally, created tension. Macedonian elites were used to hierarchy, but not to one man being untouchable. Then came the emotional side, the part that's harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore. When Hephaestion died, Alexander's reaction wasn't political. It wasn't measured. It was devastating. He reportedly wept uncontrollably, refused food, and ordered an empire-wide mourning. This wasn't the reaction of a king losing a general. This was the reaction of a man losing something irreplaceable, and maybe that's the simplest way to understand it. In a life filled with conquest, ambition, and excess, Hephaestion was the one constant, the one relationship that didn't need to be negotiated, arranged, or conquered, which, ironically, made it the most powerful of all. If Alexander the Great experienced something close to genuine emotional connection with Hephaestion, his marriages told a very different story, one where love took a back seat and power drove the entire arrangement. Because for Alexander, marriage was never just about companionship. It was about control, legitimacy, and the delicate art of holding together an empire that stretched far beyond Macedon. His first and perhaps most famous wife was Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman. According to ancient accounts, Alexander was genuinely captivated by her beauty, one of the rare moments where something resembling attraction may have influenced his decisions. But even here, romance didn't exist in a vacuum. By marrying Roxana, he secured loyalty in a newly conquered region, turning a potential rebellion into a political alliance. So yes, he may have admired her. But he also knew exactly what he was doing. And then things escalated. Later, at the height of his power, Alexander orchestrated one of the most ambitious mass weddings in history at Susa. In a single grand ceremony, he and many of his officers married Persian noblewomen. Among them were Statera and Parysatis, both connected to the former ruling dynasty of Persia. This wasn't about affection. This was about sending a message. Alexander wasn't just conquering Persia. He was becoming Persia. By marrying into the family of Darius III, he blurred the line between victor and successor. He wasn't destroying the old order, he was absorbing it, and his companions were expected to do the same. Predictably, not everyone loved this idea. Many Macedonians saw these marriages as a betrayal of their traditions. To them, Alexander was no longer just their king. He was adopting foreign customs, foreign clothing, and now foreign wives. It felt less like expansion, and more like transformation. But Alexander didn't seem particularly concerned with their discomfort, because to him, relationships, especially marriage, were tools. Useful ones, powerful ones, but tools nonetheless. They could stabilize regions, secure loyalty, and reshape identity on a massive scale. And if emotions happened to exist within those arrangements, that was almost incidental. In Alexander's world, love might appear now and then, but strategy was always in control. And that meant even the most intimate bonds were never truly personal. By the time Alexander the Great had conquered the vast lands of the Persian Empire, something subtle, but deeply controversial, began to change. It wasn't just the borders of his empire expanding, it was his identity, and with it, his approach to relationships, loyalty, and even intimacy. Because stepping into the world of Persia meant stepping into a culture with very different expectations. The court of Darius III had operated on elaborate rituals, strict hierarchies, and customs that to Macedonian eyes seemed almost excessive. Displays of submission, courtly etiquette, and the presence of royal companions, sometimes including eunuchs and favoured attendants, created an environment where personal and political closeness were often intertwined. And Alexander didn't just tolerate these customs, he embraced them. He began adopting Persian dress, incorporating their ceremonial practices, and surrounding himself with individuals who fit into this new, more fluid court culture. One of the most notable among them was Bagoas, a figure described in ancient sources as a eunuch and a close companion of the king. Now this is where things become uncomfortable for his Macedonian generals. Bagoas wasn't just present, he was favoured. Publicly, there are accounts suggesting Alexander showed him open affection, even in front of his troops. At one event, it's said that the soldiers themselves encouraged Alexander to kiss him, and he did so without hesitation, which tells you two things. First, this behaviour wasn't entirely hidden. It was visible, acknowledged, even accepted in certain contexts. Second, it pushed boundaries. For the Macedonians, this was foreign. Their traditions valued camaraderie, yes, even deep emotional bonds between men. But this kind of public display, influenced by Persian customs, blurred lines they weren't entirely comfortable crossing. And Alexander didn't exactly ease their concerns. If anything, he leaned further into this hybrid identity, part Macedonian conqueror, part Persian king. His court became a place where different cultural expectations collided, merged, and occasionally clashed. Relationships in this environment became even harder to define. Were they personal, political, cultural performances? All of the above? Probably, because Alexander was no longer operating within a single system of values. He was building something new, something that fused worlds together, whether people liked it or not. And in doing so, he created a space where loyalty, affection, and desire didn't follow clear rules anymore, which, depending on where you stood, was either visionary or deeply unsettling. As Alexander the Great pushed deeper into Asia, something else expanded alongside his empire, his appetite for excess, not just in conquest but in lifestyle. And in that world of constant victory, blurred identity, and absolute power, restraint slowly became optional. At first, Macedonian culture had its limits. Drinking, feasting, celebrating. These were nothing new. But under Alexander, they evolved into something far more intense. Banquets became spectacles. Nights stretched into early mornings. Wine flowed not as a luxury, but as a constant. And with that came a shift. Because in these environments, half military camp, half royal court, boundaries naturally began to loosen. Hierarchies softened under intoxication. Conversations became more honest, or more reckless, depending on how much had been consumed. Relationships, already complicated by politics and loyalty, became even harder to define. Alexander himself was no stranger to these indulgences. He could drink heavily, sometimes dangerously so. And while ancient writers often dramatize these scenes, there's a consistent pattern. Moments of extreme celebration often led to equally extreme consequences. Take the infamous banquet that ended in tragedy, the death of Clytus the Black. What began as a feast turned into an argument, fueled by pride, tension, and far too much wine. Clytus criticized Alexander, questioned his growing adoption of Persian customs, and in a sudden burst of anger, Alexander killed him, just like that. And the next day, regret. Deep, overwhelming regret. But the pattern didn't stop, because this is what unchecked power does. When no one can truly challenge you, when your word is law, and when your environment constantly reinforces your greatness, your impulses start to feel justified, even when they aren't. At the same time, Alexander's court became a place where pleasure and politics mixed freely. Entertainers, musicians, companions, both male and female, moved through these gatherings, part of a culture that celebrated excess as a reflection of success. Victory wasn't just something to be achieved, it was something to be lived. And perhaps more dangerously, it was something to be proven, again and again, through displays of wealth, dominance, and indulgence. But beneath it all, there was a growing tension. Because while Alexander embraced this lifestyle, many of his Macedonian companions didn't fully recognize him anymore. The man who once fought beside them now seemed distant, wrapped in luxury, influenced by foreign customs, and increasingly unpredictable. And in that gap between who he was and who he was becoming, the excess wasn't just personal, it was a warning sign. In the world of Alexander the Great, loyalty was everything, not optional, not flexible, absolute. And the closer someone stood to him, emotionally, politically, or personally, the more dangerous that closeness became. Because proximity to Alexander didn't just bring privilege, it brought pressure and jealousy. His inner circle was filled with men who had grown up with him, fought beside him, and bled for his victories. These weren't distant officials. They were companions, bound by shared risk and ambition. But as Alexander's relationships deepened with certain individuals, especially figures like Hephaestion, that balance began to crack. Hephaestion wasn't just trusted, he was favoured. And in a court where status meant everything, favouritism was like pouring oil onto an already burning fire. Other generals, men of equal experience, equal bravery, found themselves quietly pushed aside. Not officially, not openly, but enough to feel it. And that feeling turned into resentment. Because here's the problem. In Alexander's world, emotional closeness often translated into political power. If he trusted you, you gained influence. If he admired you, doors opened. And if he loved you, whatever that meant in his context, you stood above the rest, which made every relationship a competition, whether anyone admitted it or not. Even smaller moments carried weight. A glance, a gesture, an invitation to a private conversation. These things were observed, interpreted, sometimes exaggerated. In a court this intense, nothing was ever just personal. Everything was political. And that meant relationships were constantly under pressure, not just from Alexander himself, but from everyone watching. At the same time, Alexander demanded an almost impossible level of devotion. He expected his companions to follow him across deserts, into unknown lands, against overwhelming odds, and most of them did. But devotion has limits, and when those limits were tested, when exhaustion set in, when doubts crept in, when the cost of loyalty became too high, cracks began to show. Some spoke out, quietly at first. Others didn't get the chance, because Alexander's response to perceived betrayal could be swift and final, which created a paradox. The closer you were to him, the more you were trusted, but also the more you had to lose. And in that environment, where affection, loyalty, and power were constantly overlapping, relationships weren't just complicated, they were dangerous. For years, Alexander the Great had lived in a state of constant motion, conquering, expanding, consuming the world at a pace no one else could match. But in 324 BCE, something happened that no army, no strategy, and no ambition could prepare him for. Hephaestion died, and just like that, the one constant in Alexander's life was gone. Hephaestion fell ill in Ecbatana, reportedly after a fever, possibly worsened by overindulgence, which, given the court's lifestyle, wasn't exactly rare. But what followed wasn't a measured royal response. It wasn't political. It wasn't composed. It was devastation. Alexander's reaction shocked even those closest to him. He threw himself onto Hephaestion's body, weeping uncontrollably. He refused food. He cut his hair, a symbolic gesture echoing the grief of Achilles mourning Patroclus, a comparison Alexander had long embraced. This wasn't subtle mourning. This was raw, overwhelming, almost theatrical grief, but very real. And then came the scale of it. Alexander ordered an empire-wide mourning. Temples extinguished their sacred flames. A massive funeral was planned, extravagant even by royal standards. The cost was enormous, the symbolism even greater. Hephaestion was not just being honoured as a general, he was being elevated to something close to divine, which raised uncomfortable questions, because kings mourn. Leaders honour their fallen. But this felt different, more personal, more intense, less like the loss of a companion, and more like the loss of something irreplaceable. And for Alexander it was. After Hephaestion's death, something in him shifted. The balance that had once held his excesses in check, barely but still, was gone. His decisions became sharper, sometimes harsher, his behaviour more unpredictable. It's as if the one person who could ground him, who could meet him as an equal, had disappeared, and left nothing behind to replace that role. Even his later actions carry that shadow. There's a sense that after this moment, Alexander wasn't just ruling an empire anymore, he was chasing something, or perhaps trying to fill something. Because grief, especially the kind that isn't resolved, doesn't just fade, it transforms. And in Alexander's case, it seemed to amplify everything. His ambition, his intensity, his need to prove something, even if no one could quite say what that something was anymore. For a man who had conquered nearly the entire known world, this was the one battle he couldn't win. And it may have been the one that changed him the most. After the death of Hephaestion, something in Alexander the Great never fully recovered. The man who once thrived on connection, whether through loyalty, admiration, or desire, began to drift into something far more solitary. And for someone who had always been surrounded by people, that kind of isolation was dangerous. His remaining relationships continued, at least on the surface. His wives, Roxana, Statera, and Parysatis, still existed within the structure of his court. But there's little evidence that any of these bonds carried the same emotional weight as what he had shared with Hephaestion. They were present, they were important, but they were not central. Instead, Alexander seemed to turn further inward, or perhaps further into excess. His drinking reportedly intensified. His moods became more volatile. Decisions, once calculated and bold, sometimes appeared impulsive or driven by emotion rather than strategy. And those around him noticed. His generals, already uneasy with his adoption of Persian customs, now faced a king who seemed increasingly unpredictable. The familiar Alexander, the one they had followed across continents, was harder to recognise. In his place stood someone more distant, more intense, and at times more erratic. Trust, once a defining feature of his inner circle, began to erode. Not completely, but enough to matter. At the same time, Alexander continued pushing forward with plans. New campaigns, new expansions, new ambitions that stretched even beyond the edges of his already massive empire. It was as if stopping wasn't an option, as if slowing down might force him to confront something he wasn't ready to face. So he kept moving, but movement doesn't always mean progress. Sometimes it's avoidance. And in Alexander's case, the line between the two was becoming increasingly blurred. By the time he reached Babylon, the centre of his empire, there was a sense, not necessarily of collapse, but of tension building beneath the surface. The court was still functioning. The empire still stood, but the man at its centre was no longer the same. His relationships had thinned, his emotional anchors were gone, and the world he had built around himself, full of power, conquest and excess, was starting to feel empty. For a man who had everything, that might have been the most dangerous position of all. When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BCE, at just 32 years old, he left behind more than an empire. He left behind a mystery. One that wasn't just about how he died, but about who he truly was beneath the armour, the ambition, and the legend. Because Alexander's personal life doesn't fit neatly into categories. And that's exactly why it continues to fascinate people thousands of years later. His relationships, whether with Hephaestion, Roxana, or figures like Bagoas, weren't simple. They existed in a world where modern labels didn't apply, and where cultural norms were far more fluid than we often assume. Was he driven by love? By desire? By strategy? The honest answer is all of it. At different times, for different people, under different circumstances, and that's what makes his story so compelling. Alexander lived in extremes. He didn't just conquer lands, he absorbed cultures, reshaped identities, and blurred boundaries wherever he went. His personal relationships reflected that same intensity. They crossed lines between friendship and intimacy, between loyalty and dependence, between genuine connection and calculated alliance. And perhaps most importantly, they revealed something deeply human beneath all the myth, because for all his victories, Alexander was still searching for connection, for understanding, for something that matched the scale of his own ambition. He found glimpses of it in certain people, especially Hephaestion, but those moments were rare and often fragile. In the end, his empire fractured almost immediately after his death. His generals, once bound by loyalty, turned against each other. His family became entangled in power struggles, betrayals, and assassinations. The relationships he had built, whether personal or political, could not outlive him. And maybe that says everything, because Alexander could command armies, reshape continents, and demand absolute loyalty. But even he couldn't create something permanent out of relationships that were constantly under pressure from power, ambition, and excess. So what remains is not a clear picture, but a complex one. A man who loved deeply but not simply, a ruler who used relationships, but was also shaped by them, and a legacy that refuses to be reduced to a single definition, which, in a strange way, might be the most honest reflection of Alexander himself. Long before cookbooks, celebrity chefs, or anyone arguing about the correct way to boil pasta, humans were already experimenting with something far more important than taste: survival. The earliest kitchens were nothing like what you're imagining. No counters, no utensils neatly arranged, no comforting smell of baked bread drifting through a stone house. Instead, picture open fires flickering in caves or simple shelters, surrounded by smoke that probably made everyone's eyes burn like they had just made a very bad life decision. But that fire changed everything. Before cooking, food was tough, raw, and often dangerous. Meat had to be chewed endlessly, plants could be toxic, and digestion was, let's just say, inefficient. Once humans learned to control fire, something remarkable happened. Food became softer, safer, and easier to eat. Suddenly meals weren't just about surviving the day. They became something you could actually experience. And like most great discoveries, it probably wasn't planned. Maybe someone dropped meat into a fire by accident. Maybe someone was hungry enough to try anything. Either way, once people realized that cooked food tasted better and didn't fight back quite as much, they weren't going back. From there, things evolved quickly. Early humans began building simple hearths, controlled fire pits that became the center of daily life. These weren't just for cooking, they were gathering places, social hubs, the original group chat, except instead of typing, you were staring into flames and hoping your dinner didn't burn. Cooking also introduced something unexpected: creativity. At first it was basic: roast meat over fire, heat plants, try not to poison yourself. But slowly, humans began experimenting, wrapping food in leaves, burying it in hot ash, even using heated stones to cook liquids. It wasn't refined, but it was clever. And most importantly, it was shared. Because cooking is never just about food. It's about people sitting around a fire, waiting, talking, watching, learning. Recipes weren't written down. They were passed through observation, through repetition, through that one person who insisted they knew a better way to cook everything. So while ancient kitchens may look primitive to us, they represent something far bigger. They were the beginning of culture, because the moment humans stopped just eating and started cooking, they weren't just feeding their bodies anymore. They were creating experiences. And once that started, there was no turning back. Once humans figured out that fire could turn survival into something slightly more enjoyable, the next logical step was inevitable. Someone, somewhere, decided to get organized about it. Welcome to ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, often called the cradle of civilization, and more importantly for our purposes, the place where cooking finally started to look like actual cooking. Because this is where things get serious. Unlike earlier societies, Mesopotamians didn't just cook, they wrote things down, and among those records were some of the oldest known recipes in human history, etched into clay tablets. Not exactly a glossy cookbook, but still a massive upgrade from just throw it in the fire and hope. These weren't simple instructions either. They described stews, rich, slow-cooked mixtures of meat, vegetables, herbs and spices. And if you're imagining something bland, think again. Mesopotamian cuisine was surprisingly complex. They used ingredients like onions, garlic, leeks, cumin, coriander, and even beer as a cooking liquid. Yes, beer. Which means at some point, someone looked at their drink and thought, you know what this needs? Meat. And they were absolutely right. Cooking methods also evolved. Instead of just roasting food over an open flame, Mesopotamians developed ovens, enclosed spaces that allowed for better heat control. Clay pots became essential, making it possible to boil, simmer, and create dishes that required patience rather than just fire and optimism. This changed everything. Because now, cooking wasn't just about making food edible. It was about flavor, texture, and technique. It became a skill, something that could be learned, improved, even admired. And like all good things, it became social. Meals in Mesopotamia were shared, often in groups, with bread acting as both food and utensil. You didn't just eat. You dipped, scooped, and engaged with your meal in a way that feels surprisingly modern. But here's the interesting part. These early recipes weren't written for beginners. They assumed you already knew what you were doing. No measurements, no exact times, just instructions like prepare the meat or add spices, which is ancient chef language for figure it out. So while they may have invented the first recipes, they also invented something else. The idea that cooking is part science and part guesswork. And honestly, that hasn't changed much. Because even today, somewhere in the world, someone is staring at a recipe thinking, that seems like enough spice. Which, as Mesopotamia proved thousands of years ago, is either the beginning of something delicious or a very memorable mistake. If Mesopotamia gave us the first written recipes, ancient Egypt took cooking and turned it into something far more structured, almost industrial, but still deeply human. Because in Egypt, food wasn't just about flavor, it was about rhythm. Life along the Nile followed a predictable cycle: flood, plant, harvest, and cooking evolved around that same steady pattern. At the center of it all were two essentials: bread and beer. Not optional, not occasional. daily. And yes, beer again. Egyptians consumed it constantly, partly because water wasn't always safe, and partly because, well, it worked. It was nutritious, filling, and just strong enough to make long days of labour slightly more tolerable. Bread, on the other hand, was everywhere. But this wasn't your modern soft loaf. Egyptian bread could be dense, gritty, sometimes even containing traces of sand from the grinding stones. Imagine biting into your lunch and getting a subtle crunch you definitely didn't ask for. Dental records from the time suggest this was not a great long-term plan for your teeth. Still, it got the job done. What made Egyptian cooking interesting wasn't luxury. It was efficiency. They developed clay ovens, often shaped like beehives, which allowed them to bake large quantities of bread at once. These ovens trapped heat effectively, making them far more advanced than simple open fires. And once you have reliable ovens, you have options. Vegetables like onions, garlic, and lentils became staples. Fish from the Nile was common. Meat existed, but for most people it was occasional, more of a treat than a daily expectation. Spices and herbs added flavour, though nothing too overwhelming. Egyptian cuisine leaned practical rather than extravagant. But don't mistake practical for boring, because within those limitations there was creativity. Food could be dried, salted, or preserved for later use. Meals were prepared with care, often shared among family, reinforcing social bonds just as much as nourishment. And then there were the elites. While the average worker was eating bread and beer, the wealthy enjoyed a much wider variety. Meats, fruits, honey, wine. Their tables were fuller, their meals more elaborate. Same culture, very different experience, which tells you something important. Even in the ancient world, food reflected status, but across all levels of society, one thing remained constant. Cooking was part of daily life, woven into the structure of existence itself. It wasn't entertainment. It wasn't optional. It was survival, routine, and identity, all baked into one. And sometimes, quite literally, into a very gritty loaf of bread. If Egypt mastered routine, ancient Greece decided to add something else to cooking: opinion. Because for the Greeks, food wasn't just about eating, it was about thinking, discussing, judging, and occasionally pretending simplicity was a moral achievement. Greek cuisine at its core was surprisingly modest. Staples like bread, olives, cheese, and wine dominated daily life. Meat existed, but like in many ancient societies, it wasn't an everyday luxury for most people. Instead, meals leaned heavily on what the land easily provided, which sounds humble, and it was, but the Greeks had a way of turning simplicity into something almost philosophical. Take olive oil, for example. It wasn't just an ingredient. It was everywhere, used in cooking, in rituals, even on the body. If there was a problem, olive oil was probably involved in solving it. Food, in this sense, wasn't separate from life. It was woven into everything. Cooking methods stayed relatively straightforward. Grilling, boiling, baking. Nothing overly complicated. But what mattered wasn't just how food was prepared, it was how it was experienced. Enter the symposium. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a social event. Part meal, part intellectual gathering, part controlled chaos depending on how much wine was involved. Men would recline, eat, drink diluted wine, and discuss everything from politics to philosophy to, occasionally, things that made a lot less sense after the third cup. And this is where food becomes something more, because in Greece, eating was tied to conversation. Meals were slow, shared, interactive. You weren't just consuming food. You were participating in a social ritual. Even the way they approached luxury was interesting. Spartan culture, for example, took simplicity to an extreme. Their famous black broth was, well, let's just say it prioritized nutrition over enjoyment. Other Greeks reportedly found it almost inedible, which didn't stop Spartans from treating it like a badge of honor. Meanwhile, in places like Athens, cuisine could be more refined, with access to imported ingredients and more variety. Same civilization, very different tastes. And that contrast mattered, because Greek cooking wasn't just about what you ate, it reflected who you were. Your region, your status, your values. Were you disciplined and austere, or relaxed and indulgent? Your plate answered that question before you even spoke. So while Greek food might seem simple on the surface, it carried something deeper. It wasn't trying to impress you with complexity, It was inviting you to sit down, eat slowly, and, very importantly, have an opinion about it. If the Greeks turned food into philosophy, the Romans looked at that idea and said, "That's nice, but what if we made it bigger, louder, and just a little bit excessive?" Because Roman cooking didn't just evolve, it expanded massively. In the crowded streets of ancient Rome, food wasn't confined to homes. In fact, many people didn't even have proper kitchens. Instead, they relied on street vendors, small shops, and fast food-style establishments known as thermopolia. Essentially, the ancient version of grabbing something quick on your way home. And yes, this was real street food. Hot meals served in clay pots, ready to eat, stews, bread, lentils, sausages, simple, filling, and available to anyone with a few coins. If you think modern fast food is a recent invention, the Romans would like a word. But that's only one side of the story. Because while the average Roman was eating something practical from a street counter, the elite were doing something very different. They were hosting banquets. Not normal dinners, performances. Roman elite dining was about display. Wealth, status, and power were all communicated through food. Dishes became more elaborate, more exotic, sometimes bordering on absurd. Ingredients were imported from across the empire. Flavors were intensified with sauces, spices, and one very famous addition, garum. Now, garum deserves a moment. It was a fermented fish sauce, strong, salty, and absolutely everywhere in Roman cuisine. Imagine something between fish sauce and, well, something you're not entirely sure you want to imagine. But Romans loved it. They poured it over everything. And if that sounds intense, it gets better. Some banquets included multiple courses, unusual combinations, and dishes designed to surprise guests. Not always in a good way. There are accounts of extravagant presentations, where the goal wasn't just to feed people, but to impress or overwhelm them. Because in Rome, food wasn't just about taste. It was about dominance. If you could serve rare ingredients, complex dishes, and endless courses, you were proving something. Not just that you were rich, but that you had access to the entire empire. And the contrast between rich and poor couldn't have been clearer. On one side, quick meals, simple ingredients, daily survival. On the other, luxury, excess, and a dining experience that sometimes felt more like theatre than nourishment. But both shared one thing, a culture that took food seriously. Whether you were eating standing at a street stall or reclining at a banquet, food in Rome wasn't just fuel, it was identity, and sometimes a very strong-smelling one. While the Romans were turning food into spectacle, ancient China was quietly doing something else entirely. They were perfecting it. Because in early Chinese civilization, cooking wasn't just about taste or survival. It was about balance, harmony, control, the idea that food could influence not just your body, but your entire state of being. And unlike the trial and error chaos you might imagine in earlier kitchens, Chinese cooking developed with remarkable precision. Techniques mattered, cutting mattered, timing mattered. Everything had a purpose. From early on, Chinese cooks began using tools and methods that feel surprisingly modern. Woks for fast cooking, steaming baskets for gentle heat, fermentation for preservation and flavour. Instead of relying on heavy roasting or long boiling alone, they explored different ways to manipulate heat and texture, which meant food wasn't just cooked, it was crafted. Ingredients were carefully selected and combined to achieve balance. Hot and cold, soft and crunchy, light and rich. This wasn't random. It was intentional. Influenced by philosophical ideas about harmony and nature, even seasoning followed this logic. Rather than overwhelming dishes with a single strong flavour, Chinese cuisine often layered tastes. Salty, sweet, sour, bitter, creating something more complex, but also more controlled. And unlike Roman excess, where more often meant better, here restraint was part of the skill. Knowing when to stop was just as important as knowing what to add. Cooking spaces also reflected this organisation. Kitchens were structured, tools were specialised, and methods were repeatable. This wasn't just tradition, it was system, which meant knowledge could be passed down more consistently, and that matters. Because once cooking becomes systematic, it stops being random experimentation and starts becoming something closer to an art form. At the same time, food remained deeply social. Meals were shared, dishes placed at the centre, encouraging everyone to take part. Eating wasn't individual, it was collective. You didn't just prepare food for yourself, you prepared it for the group, which reinforced something important. Cooking wasn't just about feeding people, it was about connecting them, and perhaps that's the biggest difference. While other civilizations used food to display power or status, ancient China treated it as a reflection of harmony between people, between flavors, and between the individual and the world around them. Which, if you think about it, is a much quieter kind of sophistication, but no less powerful. While Eurasia was refining techniques and building culinary traditions, the ancient civilizations of the Americas were doing something equally remarkable, creating entirely different flavors, entirely different methods, and entirely different meanings around food. Because here, cooking wasn't just practical, it was sacred. In civilizations like the Maya civilization and the Aztec Empire, food was deeply tied to religion, ritual, and identity. Meals weren't just consumed, they were offered, shared with the gods, and woven into the structure of belief itself. And at the centre of it all was one ingredient you definitely recognise: cacao, but not the version you're thinking of. This wasn't sweet, creamy chocolate. This was a bitter, frothy drink, often mixed with spices like chili, sometimes even thickened with maize. It was powerful, energizing, and reserved for elites, warriors, and rituals. Drinking it wasn't casual. It meant something. And honestly, if you handed this version to someone expecting modern chocolate, you'd probably watch their expression change very quickly. But cacao wasn't the only innovation. Maize, corn, was the foundation of life. It was prepared in countless ways. Ground into dough, shaped into flatbreads, steamed, roasted. Techniques like nixtamalization, treating corn with alkaline substances, made it more nutritious and easier to work with, which, if you think about it, is incredibly advanced. Because that's not just cooking, that's chemistry. Cooking methods also leaned heavily on fire, but in controlled, clever ways. Open flames, clay griddles, underground ovens. Food was wrapped, buried, smoked, roasted, each method producing different textures and flavors. And unlike the heavy reliance on animal products in some old-world cuisines, plant-based ingredients played a central role. Beans, squash, peppers, tomatoes, foods that would later reshape global cuisine, were already staples here. And then there's the spice. Chili peppers weren't used cautiously. They were embraced. Heat wasn't something to avoid. It was part of the experience. Food was meant to stimulate, to challenge, to awaken, which makes sense when you realize food wasn't just nourishment. It was connection to the land, to tradition, to something larger than yourself. So while other parts of the world were perfecting techniques or displaying wealth, the Americas were doing something equally powerful. They were giving food meaning, not just what you eat, but why you eat it. And once that idea takes hold, cooking becomes more than a skill. It becomes identity. By now, one thing should be clear. Ancient cooking wasn't primitive. It was inventive, because across all these civilizations, from Mesopotamia to China to the Americas, people weren't just throwing food at fire and hoping for the best. They were building systems, tools, and techniques that quietly solved problems we still deal with today. And they did it without electricity, without modern materials, and without YouTube tutorials explaining 5 easy hacks, which honestly makes it even more impressive. Take ovens, for example. Early enclosed ovens allowed for consistent heat, something that completely changed how food could be prepared. Bread could bake evenly. Meat could roast slowly. Flavors could develop instead of just burning. Then there were pots. Clay pots, specifically. Simple, but revolutionary. Suddenly, boiling and stewing became possible on a larger scale. Ingredients could be combined, softened, blended together. This is where cooking starts to feel like cooking. Not just heating, but transforming. And people didn't stop there. In different parts of the world, they adapted tools to fit their needs. Flat stone griddles for cooking bread, steaming baskets stacked over boiling water, mortars and pestles to grind spices into something usable, even fermentation vessels, early containers that allowed food to be preserved and enhanced over time. Which brings us to an important point. Ancient cooks understood something we often overlook. Time is an ingredient. Fermentation, drying, smoking, these weren't just preservation techniques, they were flavor techniques. They changed the way food tasted, the way it felt, even the way it was digested. And all of this required observation, trial and error, patience, because no one handed them instructions. There was no manual saying, if you leave this in a sealed jar for a few days, it becomes better. Someone had to try it. Someone had to risk it. And hopefully survive the experiment. What's even more interesting is how these innovations spread. Trade routes didn't just move goods, they moved ideas. Techniques, ingredients, tools. A method developed in one region could eventually appear in another. Slightly altered, adapted to local conditions. Which means ancient cooking wasn't isolated. It was connected. And behind all of it was a quiet kind of intelligence. Not the loud, dramatic kind we associate with great inventions, but the steady, practical kind that improves daily life one small step at a time. No glory, no recognition, just better food. And maybe that's the most impressive part, because these innovations didn't aim to change the world. They just did. By the time you reach this point, it's tempting to think of ancient cooking as something distant. Smoke-filled rooms, clay pots, strange ingredients, and techniques lost to time. But here's the thing. It never really disappeared. Because almost everything we do in the kitchen today, whether you realize it or not, started there. That stew you make? That's straight out of Mesopotamia. Bread? Egypt had it on a daily schedule thousands of years ago. Street food? The Romans practically built a system around it. Balanced cooking, careful cutting, fast stir-frying. Ancient China was already doing that, while the rest of the world was still figuring out how not to burn dinner. Even chocolate, yes, your modern sweet version, traces back to the bitter, sacred drinks of the Aztec Empire and the Maya civilization. The tools have changed. The kitchens are cleaner, and thankfully there's less sand in the bread. But the core ideas? They're the same. Cooking is still about transforming raw ingredients into something better. It's still about sharing meals, creating experiences and, let's be honest, occasionally improvising when things don't go according to plan. Because that hasn't changed either. What's interesting is how these ancient traditions continue to shape identity. Different regions still carry echoes of their past. Mediterranean diets, Asian cooking techniques, Mesoamerican ingredients. They're not just trends. They're continuations, living history, served on a plate. And even the social side remains. We still gather around food. We still associate meals with comfort, celebration, and connection. Whether it's a quiet dinner or a crowded table, the idea is the same as it was thousands of years ago. Food brings people together, which might be the most important legacy of all. Because while empires rise and fall, recipes evolve, and ingredients travel across the world, one thing stays constant. Cooking is never just about food. It's about people, always has been, and it probably always will be. So the next time you cook something, even something simple, you're not just making a meal. You're continuing a tradition that started with fire, smoke, and a very curious human wondering. What happens if I heat this? Long before screens, controllers, or even paper, humans were already doing something instantly recognizable. They were playing games, not just to pass time, but to understand the world. One of the earliest known examples is the royal game of discovered in ancient Mesopotamia and dating back over 4,000 years. At first glance, it looks simple. A decorated board, a few pieces, some dice-like objects. But simplicity can be deceptive, because this game wasn't just about winning, it was about fate. Like many early games, blended strategy with chance. You could plan your moves, position your pieces, try to outthink your opponent. But in the end, the roll of the dice still had a say. And that combination wasn't random. It reflected how ancient people saw life itself. You make choices, but the outcome, not entirely in your control. Which makes these early games feel less like entertainment and more like philosophy disguised as play. And they weren't isolated. Across different civilizations, similar ideas appeared. Boards carved into stone, scratched into dirt, or carefully crafted from wood. Pieces made from whatever was available. Bones, shells, stones. The materials varied, but the concept remained the same. Structured play, rules, competition, and most importantly, interaction. Because games were rarely played alone, they were social experiences, moments where people gathered, observed, competed, and learned. You could see how someone thought by how they played, careful or reckless, patient or impulsive. In a world without formal education systems as we know them today, games quietly became teachers. They trained memory, strategy, decision-making, even emotional control, because losing has always been part of the experience. And apparently, humans have been dealing with that frustration for thousands of years. What's also interesting is where these games appeared, not just in homes, but in temples, public spaces, and even burial sites. Some boards were placed in tombs, suggesting that games weren't just for the living. They were meant to accompany people into the afterlife, which raises an interesting idea. Maybe these games weren't just about passing time. Maybe they were about preparing for something beyond it. Either way, one thing is clear. From the very beginning, humans didn't just survive. They played, and in doing so, they created something that would outlast empires, languages, and even entire civilizations. A simple idea, move a piece. Follow the rules, and see what happens next. If the earliest games hinted at fate, ancient Egypt took that idea and gave it a very specific direction, straight into the afterlife, because in Egypt, games weren't just played for fun, they were played for eternity. One of the most famous examples is Senet, a game so important it was often buried alongside the dead, which raises an interesting question. Why would you need a board game after you die? The answer lies in how Egyptians viewed existence. Life wasn't the end goal. It was preparation. The real journey began after death, and navigating that journey required more than just luck. It required knowledge, favour from the gods, and, apparently, some experience moving pieces across a board. Senet started as a simple race game. 2 players, a grid of squares, pieces moving from one end to the other. But over time, it evolved into something symbolic. The squares began to represent stages of the soul's journey through the afterlife. Obstacles, protections, moments of danger. So when you played Senet, you weren't just passing time, you were rehearsing for what came next. And that changes everything, because suddenly every move matters. Every outcome feels meaningful. Winning isn't just about beating your opponent. It's about proving something larger, something tied to belief and destiny. Even the imagery reflects this shift. Some boards were decorated with religious symbols. Certain squares had protective meanings. The game became less about competition and more about passage. And it wasn't limited to one social class. Pharaohs played it. Nobles played it. Ordinary people played it. It crossed boundaries, just like the belief system it was tied to. Whether you lived in a palace or a modest home, the idea was the same. Life is temporary, and you'd better be ready for what comes after. Of course, not every game was this intense. Egyptians also had lighter games, more casual forms of entertainment. But Senet stands out because it shows something important. Games don't just reflect society. They reflect what people fear and what they hope for. And in Egypt, what people hoped for was clear: a safe journey beyond death. So while we might look at a simple board and see a game, they saw something much bigger. A path. One you'd eventually have to walk, whether you were ready or not. If Egyptian games were about the afterlife, ancient India took a different direction. They turned games into war. Not literal war, of course, but something close enough to teach it. Because somewhere around the early centuries of the first millennium, a game emerged that would quietly reshape how humans think about strategy forever. Chaturanga. At first glance, it doesn't look revolutionary. A board, pieces, rules. But what made Chaturanga different was what it represented. An army. Each piece symbolized a part of real military structure. Infantry, cavalry, elephants, chariots. And unlike earlier games that leaned heavily on chance, this one emphasized something else entirely. Decision-making. You weren't just reacting to dice or luck. You were planning, anticipating, thinking several steps ahead. Every move had consequences. Every position mattered, which makes sense when you consider the context. Ancient India had complex political systems, shifting alliances, and frequent conflicts. Understanding strategy wasn't just useful, it was essential. And Chaturanga became a way to simulate that reality in a controlled environment. A battlefield you could reset, lose, learn, and try again. And that's powerful, because for the first time, a board game wasn't just reflecting life, it was training you for it. Over time, the game evolved and spread. As it moved west into Persia, It became known as shatranj. The rules shifted slightly, pieces changed roles, but the core idea remained the same: outthink your opponent. Eventually, this lineage would lead to something you definitely recognize: chess. But here's the interesting part. Even in its earliest form, the foundation was already there. The importance of positioning, the value of sacrifice, the idea that sometimes losing a piece is the only way to win the game. Which, if you think about it, is a pretty intense lesson to learn from a board. And just like earlier games, Chaturanga wasn't purely about entertainment. It was intellectual, educational, a reflection of how power worked in the real world. Because on the board, just like in life, you couldn't rely on luck forever. At some point, you had to think, plan, adapt, and accept that one wrong move could change everything. Which might explain why, thousands of years later, people are still sitting across from each other, staring at a board, silently thinking, this seemed easier a few moves ago. If India turned board games into strategy, ancient China took that idea and stretched it even further. They made it about control, not just of pieces, but of space, time, and patience. Enter Go, one of the oldest continuously played games in the world. At first glance, it looks almost too simple. A grid, black and white stones, no elaborate pieces, no dramatic shapes, no obvious hierarchy. And yet, it's one of the most complex games ever created. Because in Go, you're not trying to destroy your opponent. You're trying to surround them. The goal is to control territory, gradually, quietly, over time. You place stones one by one, building influence across the board. There's no immediate victory, no quick win. Everything unfolds slowly, move by move, like a conversation where neither side wants to speak too soon. And that's the point. Go rewards patience, discipline, long-term thinking. You can't rush it. You can't rely on a single brilliant move to save you. Instead, you have to understand balance. When to expand, when to defend, when to sacrifice a position to gain something more valuable elsewhere, which makes it feel less like a game and more like a philosophy. And in many ways it was. In ancient China, Go was associated with scholars, generals, and thinkers. It wasn't just something you played for fun, it was something you studied. Mastery of the game was seen as a reflection of intelligence, character, even wisdom. Because how you played revealed how you thought. Were you aggressive? Cautious? Patient enough to wait for the right moment? Or impulsive enough to ruin everything in a single move? The board didn't lie. What's also fascinating is how different it feels compared to earlier games. There's no dice, no randomness, no external force deciding your fate. Every outcome comes from the players themselves, which creates a different kind of tension. Because when you lose, there's no one else to blame. Not luck, not chance, just your decisions. And that can be uncomfortable. But it's also what makes Go so powerful. It teaches you to think beyond the immediate moment, to accept that control isn't always direct. That sometimes, the best move is the one that doesn't look impressive right away, and that winning isn't about domination. It's about balance, which, in a world obsessed with quick results, might be one of the hardest lessons to learn, and one of the most valuable. While games in India and China leaned toward strategy and discipline, medieval Europe took a slightly different approach. They made games questionable, not because people didn't enjoy them, quite the opposite. Board games were everywhere, played in castles, taverns, and homes, but there was a tension surrounding them, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they were doing something more than just entertaining people, something a little dangerous. Take games like backgammon, which has roots going back to earlier Roman and Persian games. It combined strategy with dice, meaning skill mattered, but so did luck. And that mix made it wildly popular. It also made it suspicious, because in a deeply religious society, anything involving chance started to raise eyebrows. Dice, in particular, were seen as instruments of fate, or worse, temptation. If outcomes were decided by randomness, where did that leave divine order? Some authorities weren't thrilled. At various points, games were discouraged or even banned, especially among clergy. The concern wasn't just time wasting, it was moral. Gambling, addiction, distraction from duty. Board games, in this context, weren't just harmless fun. They were potential gateways to bad behaviour. Of course, this didn't stop anyone. People kept playing. In fact, they got creative. Chess, imported from the East, became especially popular among the nobility. But even that wasn't just a game. It was interpreted as a reflection of society itself. Kings, queens, knights, bishops, pawns, each piece representing a role in the social hierarchy, which meant when you played, you weren't just moving pieces, you were reenacting the structure of medieval life, and naturally people started reading into it. Books were written about the moral lessons of chess, how each piece should behave, what it symbolised, because if you're going to play a game in medieval Europe, it might as well come with a lesson about how to live your life correctly. No pressure. Meanwhile, simpler games continued among the general population. Dice games, race games, anything that could be played quickly and socially. Taverns were full of them, often accompanied by loud arguments, questionable bets, and at least one person insisting the dice were cursed, which, to be fair, hasn't changed much. So medieval board games lived in this strange space, loved by everyone, trusted by no one. They entertained, they taught, they occasionally caused problems, and through it all, they reflected a society trying to balance enjoyment with control, because even something as simple as a game could raise a serious question. Are you playing for fun, or are you risking something more? By the time Europe entered the age of exploration, something unexpected happened to board games. They started travelling, not on their own, of course, but carried along by merchants, sailors, and empires expanding across the world. And just like spices, textiles, and ideas, games began crossing borders, adapting and transforming in ways no single culture could fully control. Because once a game leaves its original home, it doesn't stay the same. Take chess, for example. Originating from Chaturanga in India, it moved into Persia, then into the Islamic world, and eventually into Europe. Along the way, it changed. Pieces evolved. Rules shifted. The game became faster, more dynamic. By the time it reached medieval and early modern Europe, it was no longer just a reflection of ancient battle formations. It had adapted to new cultural expectations, new ideas about power, even new symbols of authority, and that pattern repeated across countless games. Merchants carried boards and rules from one port to another. Travellers learned local variations and brought them home. Suddenly, a game that once belonged to one region started appearing in another, slightly altered, slightly reinterpreted, which created something fascinating. A shared global language of play, different cultures, different rules, different boards, but the same core idea: structured competition, strategy, chance, and interaction. And just like trade itself, not all exchanges were equal. Some games spread widely, becoming dominant across continents. Others remained local, preserved within specific communities. But even then, influence seeped through. A mechanic here, a rule there. Small changes that slowly reshaped how people played. At the same time, printing technology began to play a role. For the first time, game rules could be reproduced and distributed more consistently. Boards could be designed and replicated. This meant games became more standardized, less dependent on oral tradition, which made them easier to share and easier to scale. Suddenly, you didn't need to learn a game from someone who already knew it. You could read it, follow it, play it anywhere. And that's a turning point. Because once games become portable, not just physically but culturally, they stop being tied to a single place. They become part of something bigger, a network of ideas moving across the world. So by the end of this period, board games were no longer just reflections of individual societies. They were reflections of connection, of movement, of a world that was becoming, slowly but surely, more linked than ever before. And through all of it, people kept doing the same thing they had always done: sitting down, facing each other, and making the next move. As the world moved into the industrial age, board games went through one of their biggest transformations. They became products. Up until this point, most games were handmade, crafted from wood, carved into stone, passed down, or recreated by memory. But industrialization changed everything. Printing became faster, cheaper, and more widespread. Materials like cardboard replaced expensive wood. Suddenly, games weren't just for the elite or the lucky. They were for everyone. And with that shift came something new: commercialization. Games were no longer just cultural traditions. They were things you could buy, sell, and mass-produce. Companies began designing boards, packaging them, and distributing them on a scale that had never been possible before. which meant more people could play. But it also meant games started to reflect something different. Not just society, but markets. Themes began to change. Instead of purely abstract strategy or symbolic meaning, games started telling stories, moral lessons, social ideas, even subtle propaganda. Some games were designed to teach children proper behavior, reinforce values, or simulate real-life situations. Which is where things get interesting, because one of the most famous modern board games, Monopoly, actually started as something very different. Its original version, known as the Landlord's Game, was created to demonstrate the dangers of monopolies and economic inequality. Yes, the game where you try to bankrupt your friends was originally meant to warn you not to do exactly that. Somewhere along the way, that message got slightly lost. But that's the point. As board games entered the industrial era, they became reflections of modern life. Capitalism, competition, growth. Winning wasn't just about strategy anymore. It was about accumulation, expansion, control. Sound familiar? At the same time, games became more structured. Clear rules, standardized boards, consistent experiences. No more relying on someone remembering how to play. Everything was written, printed, and repeatable, which made games easier to learn, but also less flexible. And yet, the core idea remained. People gathering around a table, engaging in something shared, laughing, competing, occasionally arguing over rules that somehow still managed to cause debates centuries after the first games were played. So while industrialization changed how games were made, it didn't change why they existed. They still connected people. They still reflected the world around them. Just now they came in a box, and sometimes with instructions that no one fully reads until it's already too late. By the time board games reached the modern era, something unexpected happened. They didn't disappear. They evolved. Because with the rise of video games, digital entertainment, and endless screens competing for attention, you might expect board games to quietly fade into the background. But instead they adapted, becoming more complex, more creative, and in many cases, more popular than ever. And not just as nostalgia, as a serious form of entertainment. Modern board games began exploring deeper mechanics, resource management, long-term strategy, cooperative play, hidden roles. Games weren't just about winning anymore. They were about experience, storytelling, immersion. Instead of simply moving pieces across a board, players were building civilizations, surviving disasters, negotiating alliances, or trying to figure out which one of their friends was secretly working against them, which, depending on the group, can get very intense very quickly. At the same time, a new wave of design philosophy emerged, one that focused on balance, fairness, and player engagement. Designers studied what made games enjoyable, what kept people invested, what made them come back, and they refined it. Which is why modern games often feel smoother, more intuitive, even when they're complex. But here's the interesting part. Even as games became more sophisticated, they also became more social. In a world where so much interaction moved online, board games offered something different. Face-to-face connection. Real reactions, real competition, real moments that couldn't be paused, rewound, or edited. You had to be present, and people started valuing that again. Board game cafes appeared, communities formed. Entire conventions were built around people gathering to play, learn, and share experiences. What was once seen as old-fashioned suddenly felt refreshing. At the same time, classic games didn't disappear. Monopoly still exists. So does chess. But now they sit alongside hundreds, thousands of new designs, each offering something different. Faster games, deeper games, cooperative games where everyone wins or loses together. Because the definition of play expanded. It's no longer just about competition. It's about interaction, about experience, about creating moments that people remember. Not because of who won, but because of what happened during the game. Which brings everything full circle, because despite all the changes, technology, design, culture, the core idea remains exactly the same as it was thousands of years ago. People sitting together, following rules, and seeing what happens next. Just now there are a lot more rules, and a lot more ways to argue about them. After thousands of years, countless civilizations, and more rule arguments than anyone would like to admit, one question remains. Why do we still play? Because if you strip everything back, the boards, the pieces, the strategies, the increasingly complicated rulebooks, you're left with something surprisingly simple. Connection. From the royal game of to Monopoly, games have always done the same thing. They bring people together, give them structure, and then let something unpredictable happen within that structure. A shared experience. And that matters more than it sounds, because games create a space where people can compete without real consequences, cooperate without real risk, and express parts of themselves they might not show otherwise. The cautious become bold. The confident make mistakes. The quiet observer suddenly makes the move that changes everything. And all of it happens within a set of agreed rules. Which is interesting, because in a way, board games mirror society itself. Systems, roles, decisions, outcomes. Some are based on chance, others on skill, but all of them reflect the same underlying truth. Life isn't entirely in your control, but your choices still matter. And maybe that's why games have lasted so long. They let us practice, not just strategy but patience, not just competition but resilience. They teach us how to lose, how to adapt, how to think ahead, and sometimes how to laugh when everything goes completely wrong. Which, historically speaking, happens a lot. At the same time, games carry memory. Families pass them down. Friends associate them with moments. Entire cultures embed meaning into them. A simple board can hold years of shared experience. Victories, defeats, inside jokes, rivalries that somehow still exist decades later. And unlike many things from the past, games don't need translation. You don't need to speak the same language to understand them. You just need to sit down, learn the rules and start playing, which makes them one of the most universal human experiences ever created. So while empires collapse, technologies change, and entire ways of life disappear, board games remain. Quietly, consistently, waiting. Because the moment two people sit across from each other, look at the board, and make the first move, the story begins again, just like it always has, and probably always will.